If you're a fan of Bloodborne still holding out hope for a remake, a PC port, or even a sequel, I genuinely feel for you. It seems like every day brings a new rumor, and with each PlayStation showcase, expectations rise that this will finally be the one to reveal it. Here on the channel, we've covered these rumors extensively, investigating their validity, but when every single one turns out to be false, it begs the question, why has Bloodborne been left behind, especially when nearly every other PlayStation IP has resurfaced in recent years? Over the past several months, the situation has become even more intriguing, with cryptic and eye-opening messages from Hidetaka Miyazaki and PlayStation addressing Bloodborne after years of silence. We're going to try to get to the bottom of this. We'll discuss possible scenarios and consider whether Bloodborne will ever make a comeback, and how. Let's begin with a recent interview with Miyazaki, where he was directly asked about the state of Bloodborne and the possibility of future releases. In an article from PC Gamer titled, Hidetaka Miyazaki knows for a fact other From Software devs want a Bloodborne PC port, Wes Fenlon writes, as I was wrapping up an interview with From Software president Hidetaka Miyazaki for PC Gamer's Shadow of the Erdtree cover story, I knew I couldn't walk out of the conference room we'd been sitting in for more than an hour without asking the question. You know, the one, Bloodborne on PC. When? He continues, I was obviously not the first person to ask Miyazaki about returning to Bloodborne or making a sequel. Just a few months ago, he told IGN that From Software doesn't own the IP rights, saying, unfortunately, and I've said this in other interviews, it's not my place to talk about Bloodborne specifically, but this next part is very interesting. He said the group laughed, and Miyazaki said, I know for a fact these guys want a Bloodborne PC port, referring to From Software producer Yasuhiro Kitao and interpreter Bobby Simpson. If I say I want one, I'll get in trouble as well. But it's nothing I'm opposed to. Obviously, as one of the creators of Bloodborne, my personal pure honest opinion is I'd love more players to be able to enjoy it, especially as a game that is now coming of age. One of those games of the past that gets lost on older hardware. I think any game like that, it'd be nice to have an opportunity for more players to be able to experience that and relive this relic of the past. So as far as I'm concerned, that's definitely not something I'd be opposed to. There's quite a bit to unpack here. For those not fully up to speed, Bloodborne isn't actually owned by From Software, even though they were the primary developers. The IP rights belong to Sony. Additionally, Japan Studio co-developed the game alongside From Software. While the extent of Japan Studio's involvement isn't entirely clear, their name appears when you start up the game. We'll touch more on that later. Miyazaki mentions he can't discuss Bloodborne or express a desire for a PC port due to legal reasons. The IP doesn't belong to him. Speculatively, he might also be aware of what's happening with the IP at Sony and is bound by confidentiality. It's also interesting that the group laughed when asked about the PC port. Even From Software themselves are aware of how much fans want it. They want it too, and they probably understand how absurd it is that it hasn't happened yet, especially when you consider that nearly every other major PlayStation exclusive has made its way to PC. So, why not Bloodborne? Is there a solid reason it's been left behind, while other games have been ported? We should note that another From Software game with Sony-owned IP, Demon's Souls, hasn't been ported either. However, Demon's Souls did receive a remake as a PS5 launch title by Bluepoint Games, which hasn't been ported to PC. One theory I find plausible is that Sony may be holding onto these From Software titles to use them as launch exclusives for their new consoles. The Demon's Souls remake didn't sell particularly well compared to other PlayStation titles, around 2 million copies as of 2022, but you have to consider the PS5's limited availability at launch. Bloodborne, on the other hand, sold very well and remains popular. From a purely numerical standpoint, it's hard to argue that these games are massive console sellers when compared to titles like God of War or Spider-Man. So perhaps Sony doesn't see the immediate financial incentive to port Bloodborne, but if they're saving it as a launch title for the PlayStation 6, that would make more sense. In the time since the Demon's Souls remake, From Software has become one of the top game studios globally, especially after the monumental success of Elden Ring. If Sony wants to capitalize on the combined clout of the From Software and Bloodborne names, saving it for a significant future release could be strategic. But if that's the case, it only makes sense if they're planning a Bloodborne remake. A PC port might undermine that effort, as modders could enhance the original game, diminishing the appeal of an official remake. However, this logic doesn't necessarily apply if a Bloodborne 2 is in the works. In fact, a PC port of the original could serve as excellent marketing for a sequel. This is where things don't add up. A Bloodborne PC port would likely sell extremely well. It's essentially free money for Sony. So, we're left wondering, is there an underlying issue preventing the port? Perhaps technical challenges related to the game's code, especially since Japan's studio has shut down. Maybe the rumors about Bloodborne being difficult to work with hold some truth. What seems most likely is that whatever is happening with Bloodborne is out of From Software's hands. Whether it's a PC port, a remake by Bluepoint Games, or a sequel by another studio, the decision makers are elsewhere. Whether that's good or bad is up to you to decide. But if there were no future plans for Bloodborne, you'd think Sony would have clarified that by now. Instead, after years of silence, they've recently been hinting at it more than ever. This whole situation is wild. The status of the Bloodborne IP is a massive mystery that could be easily solved with some transparency. But every official statement is cryptic, and each one spawns a dozen more rumors. What do you think? Is there a future for Bloodborne, and what form will it take? That's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe if you're new here. We're about to dive deep into Elden Ring DLC content in the coming week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.